thank you for joining us. And again, to sort of acknowledge Peter Hennessy. I came here as a graduate student in the early 1990s. Peter was so crucial in terms of building the college and creating the kind of environment of diversity and political engagement that really this lecture series is all about. So one of our finest, to Peter. Okay, so we have Sathnam Sanghera here, and I think that in the spirit of your book, Sathnam, where you talk for a call to hold a real dialogue on the British Empire, we're going to run this event really as an initial conversation between the two of us, and then we're going to bring you in. I should also say, you're not feeling great.
I've got the bug, I think, that all of you have had. It's going around, isn't it? Well, I don't want to cancel, but here we are. But you have to get up and vomit.
He's going to give me a nod, so we're
and then
okay.
come back. You've got a code.
We're going to be gentle, right? Okay. Okay. Can we start by talking? I guess we're here to think about Empireworld, but also think about it in relation to Empireland. So think about those two books. You write a bit in Empireworld about why you'd written it in relation to Empireland. And there's obviously the issue of the sort of responses that you got, the trolling that happened, particularly with Empireland. I just wonder if you could start by talking about the relationship between the two, because Empireland is very much about, you know, nationhood in a way, whereas Empireworld goes more global. Can you just talk a little bit about the relationship between the two, and also where that's landed, how you see Empireworld and the responses in contrast maybe to Empireland, because they're two different moments, and we'll talk about the politics of this moment later on. But can you just sort of sketch out the move between the two books, and especially where Empireworld sits?
Yeah, I guess I did it back to front, but the first book was about all the ways in which, you know, modern Britain has been shaped by empire. And so, you know, the racism, the multiculturalism, the fact that we emigrate a lot, our museums, our psychology, the Commonwealth, and so on. And I guess, you know, I'm not an historian, and it's weird talking to a room full of people who are literally imperial historians and know more than me.
Don't worry, I'm not a historian either.
But they are in the audience. There's Kim, not least. I can see him in the corner of my eye. I guess that was quite well read, and I had no intention really of repeating it, because although it was really positive in many ways, because, you know, people studied it, or people decided to study history because they read it, and it became a set text for in certain schools and so on. There's also a really angry backlash, and didn't really want to spend another 2 years in the culture wars. But then there were multiple reasons I wrote Empireworld. One of them was that I would do events like this, and I used to get trolls that would turn up. Sometimes the same guy would turn up to every single event. He might be here today, in which case, hello. And he would say the same one of two things. He would say, how dare you insult Britain when the British Empire introduced democracy to large parts of the world? Or he would say, how dare you insult Britain, given that the British Empire introduced the rule of law to large parts of the world? And he would ask the same question. I realized if you ask the same question, you're not looking for an answer. You basically want me to agree with you. But also I had a niggling feeling in the back of my head that I didn't actually have an answer to his questions. Like, did the British Empire introduce the rule of law to large parts of the world? Did the British Empire result in democracy in large parts of the world? So there was a gap. I realized there was a gap in my knowledge, and so Empireworld partly was an attempt to answer those questions.
But it's very nuanced in that respect, isn't it? Especially towards the end. So you talk about, you know, the way in which one might talk about a balance sheet in terms of empire, and you're much more ambiguous and nuanced in that account than we'd imagine from the way in which those culture wars and the way in which the sort of discourse has taken place ever since.
Yeah, the democracy question is really interesting, because if you look, it's been researched a lot. If you look at the consensus amongst the academics, it is true that the British Empire disproportionately resulted in democracy. But that doesn't mean that was the intention of British imperialists. Actually, there's lots of evidence they stood in the way. But also, opposite things can be true at the same time. And yes, it did result in democracy. You can say that. But at the same time, the British Empire definitely resulted in all sorts of geopolitical chaos around the world. So, I mean, actually, one of the best books on this subject, I was surprised to say, is by Kwasi Kwarteng, The Ghosts of Empire. And he goes through Iraq, Hong Kong, Myanmar, Nigeria. It's quite a long list of places, Sudan, where the British Empire definitely resulted in geopolitical chaos. But yeah, both things are true.
One of the things you also talk about at the beginning of the book, which I was struck by, was the way in which you talked about decolonization. And of course, it's a term that's used very much, within the academy, and how historians might talk about it generally in terms of education, to decolonize the curriculum, decolonize certain forms of history. And you have an interesting line, because you talk about eating the masala omelette, and you say you can't really take it out. It's like trying to get the ghee out of the omelette. You say you can't really do it. And at other points, you say you doubt the wisdom of continuing with this game in decolonization. You say decolonization can only ever be tokenistic. I'm kind of quite surprised, because I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think many of us would think about the way in which decolonization is not necessarily, as it were, stripping away, but it is about nuance. And I wasn't quite sure where you sat with that, and it's probably going to be something we talk about in the Q&A. But can you talk about where you stand on that argument about decolonization? What does decolonization mean for you?
Saying that doesn't mean I don't think decolonization is not worthwhile. I think there's loads of decolonization initiatives which are massively worthwhile, like the renaming of places in Australia and New Zealand, places especially that have been named after colonial massacres. India, building its own parliament for $2 billion right next to the British Parliament, literally a few yards away. I get it. They want to do their democracy in their own building. But I don't see Modi stopping Indians playing cricket. I don't see how he would go about doing that. I don't see him, he's really into decolonization. I don't see him getting rid of the use of English in adverts and in Bollywood films, right? Ultimately, you can't decolonize the world, because the world is a product of colonization. And you see these seminars like decolonizing the museum, the British Museum. How do you decolonize the British? You'd have to abolish it. I mean, it is colonial. I mean, how do you decolonize the V&A, where most of its collection comes from the East India Company Museum? Where do you begin with that? So I guess my point is, ultimately, you cannot decolonize the world. It is who we are.
But is it about that? I mean, isn't decolonizing also about sort of adding a further context to how you think about, say, those objects in the V&A?
Yeah. If you're saying that decolonization is education, I'm all for that. But that's not what some radical decolonizers want. They truly want to decolonize the British Museum.
But so what does it look like if because I mean, one thing I hope we'll talk about is what are the consequences of doing this kind of work? So what would that work look like for you in terms of thinking about decolonizing? Is it that it works in those very different contexts and you have to take it one at a time? Or how do we think about it? I mean, because people are struggling with this, I think, particularly, say, within education, what that means to decolonize.
I think it mainly involves educating and talking about it, which I don't think we've even reached that stage yet, It's about becoming aware of what structures in our life are the result of colonialism. And they're quite profound. I mean, I don't think you can understand the news today without understanding the British Empire. So just look at the news in last week. The Chagos Islands, the Daily Mail and Express and the right-wing media are crazy that we're giving back this colony that we didn't even realize we had until 3 days ago. And now they're furious. But then the Daily Mail and the Daily Express themselves, if you look at their foundation, had the empire in their very mission statement. They were set up to celebrate the empire. Of course they're going to do that. So that can be explained by empire. Israel-Palestine, that's a situation that has its roots in the Palestine Mandate that the British ran. We're bombing Yemen in a way that we did. We're doing so 100 years ago for very similar reasons. And it goes on and on. Even the US election with Kamala Harris being accused of not being black, because Americans don't understand that if you're Jamaican, you're black. And actually, people not understanding you can, as a descendant of enslaved, you can have both white and black blood in your DNA. And yeah, so I just think if you want to understand the world and the news, you've got to understand the British Empire.
And speaking specifically at that, you use the phrase a lot, and of course it's one of the things that people have pushed back on this around the issue of historical amnesia. So I just wanted to ask you a bit about that, because you talk about that distinction between imperial powers addressing national responsibility in contrast to personal guilt. And you say that's an important distinction to make, because there's a way in which I guess a lot of the right-wing response is that this is just about guilt. And you talk about an attempt to construct a sense of national responsibility. And that Britain obviously isn't doing that. Do you think that that's something specific to British political history and culture? Because I'm thinking about how might that compare with other European powers or former imperial powers, say like Portugal? Is there something very specific to that British political culture?
Absolutely not.
So
I think it's universal. And actually, there was a survey done of all the former European colonizers, I think a year ago, and we were not the most, we were the second most nostalgic country for our empire, but not the first. Can you guess who the first was of the European powers?
No, go.
The Dutch. The Dutch are even more nostalgic. And it goes everywhere. I mean, I'm a Sikh. I've never met a Sikh talking about the Sikh Empire who didn't say the Sikh Empire was wonderful, that it was enlightened, it was, diverse, it acknowledged multiple religions. And actually, it almost certainly wasn't that, because an empire involved repression and violence. I think there's something natural to feel like that about your past. I think the Russians at the moment, one of the reasons they've invaded the Ukraine is out of a sense of imperial nostalgia. But, I mean, to steal a phrase from David Oyesoga, history is not interested in your feelings, and to view history through pride or shame, because that is equally the case, is nonsensical. Because what are you proud of? I mean, are you proud of the slavery? Are you proud of the anti-slavery and abolition? Are you proud of the Great Potato Famine in Ireland, or are you proud of the Good Friday Agreement? Because both are part of your history. So it makes no sense to say you're proud. It's like saying you're proud of the sky, or you're proud of the climate over the last 400 years. Not least, it's got nothing to do with you. You had nothing to do with the climate, and you definitely had nothing to do with the British Empire, unless you're one of the few remnants of the people who ran Hong Kong or something like that, or the Chagos Islands. I think you've got to remove, if you can, personal feeling from this.
But within that, I mean, you're obviously interested in the kind of British imperial history. I mean, what is it specifically that's, for you, that's causing this deep outrage particularly? Is it driven by a specifically post-Brexit moment? I just wonder about the response, particularly first to Empireland, was so extreme. What do you think it was that triggered a response there? Is it about a sort of deeper, more embedded racism or xenophobia that's stitched into the national culture? I'm just interested in, can we really say, no, that's just empire, that's how it works, it's in Portugal, it's Germany, it's France. Surely there is exceptionalism there. There's something different that you're seeing within those national cultures. I don't know, I'm just intrigued at where you go with that.
That's a good question, that. I think Black Lives Matter made people go insane, some people on the right. I think the London Olympics 2012 made people go, the celebrations of diversity had counter effects. And I think, I mean, you see it now, it's ongoing, with people like Elon Musk saying, DEI is the ultimate racism. And the call for diversity, it's that famous line, isn't it? If you've been used to privilege your entire life, equality feels like repression. And there's just been a massive backlash. And I should say, it's not just me, it's historians across the board have been ridiculed in the culture wars. And, David Oyesoga, has a bodyguard at events like this. Corinne Fowler, who wrote the National Trust report, became scared to leave the house. Libeled in the paper every other week. It's strange because, we're just doing history. It's quite a niche thing to do, isn't it? And also, if you love the empire so much, why do you object to knowledge? If you love it so much, why are you scared about people finding out about it? Which seems to be the fundamental objection of people criticizing the National Trust, for instance. It's like, why are you giving us all this history? You know, we all want to go and see a house, and historical house, and just have the scones. And I just want selective history. So yeah, it's quite bizarre.
But do you think it's been triggered by what's happening with the sort of move to the right over the last 15, 20 years? I mean, something's changed at that moment, isn't it?
Yeah, and at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, this campaign, this imperial nostalgia, you know, is part of a well-funded network of, you know, think tanks, research bodies, political parties, the people paying for Liz Truss to go to America and spout nonsense. You know, if I was to say that, if I wanted to triple my salary overnight, I would become an imperial nostalgic. You know, I'd instantly be paid more. It's a well-paid thing to do. And a lot of the people involved in it don't even believe it. I think they've just realized it's a very politically convenient thing to do.
Why? Can you say a bit more about that? I mean, what's the driver there? I mean, that's a kind of, what is that? A sort of moment of global neoliberalism buys back into imperial nostalgia, and what's happening there?
There's a lot happening. I think one of the things basically is about race. The moment you acknowledge that black and brown people have to be equal, that they have an equal right to be in Britain or America, you have to give up some of your privilege so that they can have chances. They can have some of that power and money. And there's a lot of invested interest in making sure that people hold on to power. It does sound a bit like a conspiracy theory, I realize, but I think that fundamentally is what's driving it, you know? Do you agree? Is that too basic?
No, I do agree. I'm just curious about what that means in terms of the emotive nature of what's going on, because you were just quoting and talking about, you know, David Olusoga and talking about history does not care about anyone's feelings. It's a line that you use. Yet, what we're talking about is a deep, deep sense of anger. There is a hugely emotive issue here. And you talk in the book about, James Robbins talks about the reservoir of pain of that long imperial history, epigenetic impact of slavery, mass displacement, famine caused by corporate terrorism. That's, again, the phrase that you use. And then that real fury and the vitriol that's been created in the right-wing press to the way in which you're raising these issues.
There's also something very emotional happening, isn't it? It's like if you're a white person, you know, in life, struggling, like billions of people are, you're struggling in your life, you're struggling to make it, and you're seeing people of color with their grievances, as you see it, being elevated. That's going to make you angry. So I think there's that anger, and also on top of that, in Britain, I think a lot of people have connections to empire. Their family probably served in empire, and they see David Olusoga on the TV, or me, or someone else of color talking about grievance again. And they're saying, actually, my family, my dad, my granddad wasn't an evil person. Or they might be thinking, oh, actually, my family were working class and they were treated like crap in the Manchester mills. So why am I listening to this nonsense? So that's another type of anger that you get. But it very quickly gets racialized in that, you know, people like you, Kim, and, you know, William Dalrymple and so on have been writing about this stuff for decades. But I think now we have people of color writing about it and talking about it in quite significant numbers. And that triggers people in particular. It's that racial, it's being lectured by a brown person.
Yeah.
People find that very difficult.
Which then connects to that question you just raised about class, and I did want to ask you about, you know, how post the book coming out, what happened with the riots this August. I mean, you did speak about that, but I wondered if you could just say a bit more about how you see that within the kind of context of what you're writing in Empireworld.
Yeah, I think Britain really struggles with this more than anything else, because our national narrative is that we beat the evil racist Germans. It's a defining narrative, along with Henry VIII, right? Also, another defining narrative about us, because of Rishi Sunak, PM, RIP, is that we are a successful multicultural society. But we can't handle that the opposite's true at the same time, that we also have a long history of racism, that we created a lot of racist ideas then when we exported around the world through weird racial science. And we can't handle that. And also we have a distinct history of racial violence in Empire, which Kim writes about amazingly, in relation to the Amritsar massacre and so on, but also in this country. We have a long history of racial riots, and we call them race riots, but that implies that the people of color are somehow to blame. They're almost always racist riots. Almost going back to, is it 1919 or 1919, the first race riots? I mean, that almost the same thing happens at each one of them. It's white mobs attacking black and brown people. Often, quite weirdly, there's often a psychosexual element going on with these riots, and that often they're triggered, especially in the 20th century, by the sight of a white woman with a black man or a brown man. And you can see how that continues with the obsession with grooming in the modern far-right imagination. The white woman needs to be protected. But we have a long history of this, but I don't think that was reflected in the way the media talked about the riots when they happened.
But it is this sort of distinction, I guess you're trying to call for a more nuanced, dispassionate discussion, yet you're dealing with a very emotive issue, and many of the historians who are writing on the history of emotions would say, this is the thing, you have to engage with the fact it is so emotive. So again, I guess towards the end of the book, you talk a lot about the need for dialogue and stepping away from what you call the hoary old monologue of empire. And I'm wondering what that starts to look like. I mean, the cat's out of the bag now, brilliantly, because you've been part of that process. What is that dialogue going to look like? How does it take place? How do we effect that kind of change when we have the kind of problem that we do with the media, which the shrillness of that cry, and looking for that nuance? How do we make that work?
I don't think you can really entirely get rid of emotion. I think more important is that we get comfortable with the idea of contradictions. Yeah, and I guess I've been going on about that already. But, if you look at all the books surveying the British Empire until I've read, have a take. Either Empire was good or it was bad. And what I see from reading all of them is that actually Empire was opposite things at the same time. So it was slavery and anti-slavery. It did result in democracy and chaos. It did involve the spread of the free press. It also resulted in press censorship. It involved the destruction of the environment around the world. We destroyed 60% of New Zealand's forests. But also British imperialists were involved in the birth of environmentalism. They don't balance each other out, but opposite things are definitely true at the same time. And I think talking about it in that way does open up the possibility of dialogue, but I also find that I just piss everyone off. So, I mean, I'll get people after this who'll say, you're too nice about empire. And then other people are saying, oh, you're just too angry. I get a lot of that. And I think that's partly because that's the only way we've ever talked about empire. That's how we talked about empire during empire. If you look at the way it was discussed, it was the balance sheet. It was, is empire profitable for us overall or not? Is it good or bad? That's the way they discussed it in the 19th century. And it's a way we talk about it. It's a way Michael Portillo talks about it on his shitty programs about railways, which are probably on right now on BBC Two.
He's going to use that as a puff for the next series, I think, actually. Well, it's interesting because, from when I was coming through doing literature and history, and you talked about imperial history, the 80s and 90s, it was a kind of given. There wasn't the sort of debate now. It was just you'd engage and you'd talk about imperial history, and Catherine Hall was doing that kind of work and other scholars at the time. It has shifted. There's a sense in which you have to say, no, it runs like a stick of rock through everything. And that was something that we didn't really get or see. Everybody who was on the left was talking about contradiction. It's kind of classic Marxist historiography, right? But now the debate is much clearer or starker, it seems.
Yeah, things have got much more extreme, especially, I think, both on the left and right. So on the right, I read Jan Morris's History of the Empire, Neil Ferguson's books, Jeremy Paxman's, I guess they're generally right-wing, and a lot of TV series produced from those books. But they don't flinch from describing the horrors of slavery, and they don't flinch, each one of them, talking about, very specifically, the Tasmanian genocide. Which is a useful example because now the imperially nostalgic writers of today are denying the Tasmanian genocide. I don't want to publicize who they are, but you probably know who they are. And that's where we've gone. I mean, the Tasmanian genocide is so important that when the legal definition of genocide was created in the 20th century, that was one of the examples that was used. It's a very clear example of British imperialists wiping out a people, or trying to. But now it's just unbelievable that the Daily Telegraph runs articles casually denying it. It happened, or giving other explanations for it. But that's how far we've gone in terms of imperial nostalgia, and in terms of the defense of empire.
And what about the other move in terms of sort of political discourse, or the argument, because you talk about it in the book about for financial reparations. It's a very different argument, which is not about dialogue and debate sort of within this context, but the need for that. CARICOM, we know this, the Caribbean, claiming $33 trillion in terms of recompense, a kind of truth and reconciliation moment. Do you think that there's a political will or a need for those kind of decisions about reparations, about some sort of reckoning, a truth and reconciliation process of coming to terms with empire?
I think we've got to start talking about it. It's interesting that the next 3 candidates for the Commonwealth to lead it are all of them believe in reparations. So it's not going to go away. There's an international conversation that we're falling behind on. But I also understand why in Britain people clutch their pearls when you mention we owe $33 trillion in reparations, because we can't build HS2. We can't. The Wi-Fi is crap in Cornwall. we haven't got $33 trillion. And also intellectually, I get it, because how do you put value on an individual life? 3 million Africans, how much is each life worth? But I actually think, as a country, we have started the process. We just don't realize it. I would say that the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland was a process of post-colonial truth and reconciliation. Money was invested. You could call that reparations. There were official apologies. I think Tony Blair apologized for the Great Potato Famine. I think there's been an apology for Bloody Sunday. And I would say, as a consequence, our relationship with Ireland is much better. I think something similar happened in Kenya. Again, we didn't do it willingly. We were dragged to court around because of the Mau Mau history. We lost that court case. We paid £20 million compensation. You could call it reparations. William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, apologized. And as a result of that, the Royal Tour of Kenya last year, was it this year? Was the only, I think, sane Royal Tour we've ever had. Because King Charles talked about the atrocities. He went to places where really bad shit happened. And as a result, our relationship with Kenya is healthier. I think we just need to do that now with about 67 more countries. And we need to do it willingly. It can't just be kind of by accident. We need to engage in the international conversation.
I was thinking, looking at the book again, and I was noticing, and you use this language about healthiness, the need to sort of heal, and also the idea of a sick body politic because of empire. And I was sort of wondering about saying to you, do we need as much therapy as we need history? That sense of where does this go? How do you engage? Is it about reparations? I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa very much was about a sort of national process of trauma and therapy that you had to go through. And I wonder how important that becomes as a way of somehow people engaging with a sense of their own past, their families, either their implication in empire or their subjection to empire.
Yeah, absolutely. It has to be about that. Reparative justice, to use one of the phrases. It can't just be about money, because we can't bring people back. Ultimately, money's not going to heal this. Just as important is the psychological and the education elements of this. And I do think I always draw a parallel between the work that imperial historians are doing and therapy, because David and I get accused all the time, and actually probably every imperial historian gets accused of hating Britain. Do you hate Britain? Why do you carry on doing this? You must really hate Britain now that you know the facts about the Amritsar massacre. It's like, no, I don't. And actually, I wrote a memoir about my family, spent 3 or 4 years talking about it and finding out really unhappy things about my family. Did that make me hate my family? No. The exact opposite. It was an act of love that I spent 3 years digging this up. And if anything, it made me appreciate them more. And I feel the same role, history can play the same role. I feel like I've done this work because I love my country. I want to know the history for real, warts and all, to understand it, because understanding it means that we can navigate our future in a saner way than we have done recently.
That's interesting. Maybe we won't go into sort of love of nationhood, and maybe we won't go there. We'll talk about. I wanted to ask you about education, because what's interesting is that I was just struck by the book that you wrote, Stolen History. So you talked about memoir and how you've written memoir, but also Stolen History, which is the truth about the British Empire and how it shaped us, which is for kids 9 and upwards. So I wondered again, what you think in terms of
only book my sister has read.
Well, then it's a win.
Yeah. She's 56. But anyway, I should say.
Did she not see the 9+ label?
Anyway, sorry, you're saying.
Where does that land? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? We were talking a bit about this before we came on in terms of what we might call trade books, commercial books, and where they land, why you do events like this. What is the impact of that work that we do, which is different from academic books, right? And that work for kids and how we might teach empire in schools. How do you see that landscape evolving? Because there's people in this room, who are involved in that kind of work, and it's a struggle. Politically, it's tough in terms of how you engage with it and the problems that you deal with in terms of confronting that history, because it is very confronting.
Yeah,
Where
I'm
do you go with
surprised that no one's tried to ban the book yet. Well, under the last government. I was braced for that. But I feel like actually there's a difference between what the politicians are trying to do and what the public want. Again, there was a survey last year which found that 75% of people, British people, think it's a good idea to teach kids about slavery and colonialism. That's quite high. But you'd never guess that from our newspapers or our politicians. And it's weird, but going into these schools and talking to kids it's a very positive experience, but also unnerving, because this is stuff I didn't know about until my 40s. And I sat through dozens of Remembrance Day services, very multicultural part of Britain. No one, not once, mentioned that millions of Asians, Indians, Africans, Sikhs fought in both world wars. It just never occurred to me. I mean, it would have been relevant. But I remember in 1998, Bernard Manning went on Mrs. Merton's show, on BBC Two, this is primetime TV, and said, oh, you know what, there were no Pakis at Dunkirk. This is on primetime TV in 1998. He was factually right in that Pakistan didn't exist during World War II. So, but I don't think that's what he meant. And he was otherwise wrong, right? Yeah. But it fills me with a bit of envy, because I was in my 40s until I understood the extent of that. But also, I just think they're going to have much saner lives in Britain, and they're going to feel like they belong more, to know that history, to know that there were black and brown people going back to Henry VIII's court. That Jane Austen's Mansfield Park is partly a dialogue about slavery. You can feel, if you understand this history, you can feel a connection with the canon, right? And so that's exciting, but also I feel envious that they've got that and I didn't. Okay. Did you know it at school?
Which?
All that stuff about empire and the stuff we're talking about.
I did, because I was proselytized as a Marxist by a Sikh.
All right, okay.
When I was in Bradford when I was 15. He gave me Lenin to read. So in a way, I mean, that's what's interesting about those differential moments, isn't it, within history, those pockets of where you pick up that kind of history. So, yeah, in a way, I guess I did, but that's another story. It's not about me.
Yeah, education's a weird one, because all of us have had an education, so very quickly the conversation comes like a conversation about autobiographies. Yeah. But we don't often realize that our education was not typical. I have noticed that people who were educated in Britain in the 70s often have quite a good sense of empire. There was an outburst of teaching about empire in the 70s, and then it kind of disappeared in the 80s. And now I think there's another renaissance.
Well, you wonder about that in terms of the rollback, because that's when I was learning, later 70s, early 80s. But you know, that moment, it was a sort of Labour administration, and of course then there was Thatcher, and the massive rollback, I guess, started in a way then. And I just wondered, last question, because then I do want to open it up. Do you feel a sense of hope in terms of what the new Labour administration might represent, in terms of how that culture wars debate might be shifting? I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I do feel a bit of hope. Obviously, they're fucking things up in some ways.
Really?
But, you know, they're rethinking the curriculum. I'm sure there'll be change. We've got a foreign secretary who has read books on empire and has talked about empire. He seems to apply it quite selectively.
Yeah, pretty.
Some of the lessons he's learned. But I do feel that change is happening. It's just very, very slow.
That's a nice way to end. So we're going to end and thank Sathnam in a minute, but I just want to also thank the organisers tonight, Tom Chidwick and also Rob Saunders, for delivering this. It's been a brilliant event. Thank you all for coming. Sathnam is going to stay and sign books, I believe.
Spread my infection.
Spread your infection.
Yeah.
What did you say? I was going to just lost a whole bunch of sales. Anyway, so you can come and get your book signed if you want at a distance. And we just leaves me to thank Sathnam Sanghera for coming to speak and deliver the Hennessy lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.